So let's talk about hills. I just wanted to give a little bit of the philosophy that I have about hills before getting into some of the deeper questions, but I definitely want to answer the questions that you may have about them. And if you have any questions, go ahead. There's a question mark right down below that you can hit the question mark. And as I'm talking, I will answer those questions. Or again, if you want to jump up on stage, I believe there's a button somewhere that says, I want to be up there and talk right next to you. And just to let you know that I will be posting this later on, so this recording, I'll edit some things out. But for the most part, I'll be uploading the video. So let's talk about hills real quick from my perspective. So I believe in my theory, in the way I coach, is there's a time and a place for specific hill workouts. And they're usually at the beginning of the season. And let me rewind just for 1 second, because there is two different ways to run hills, in my opinion. And I think there's some confusion out there when people talk about hill running. And what I mean by that is that there's there's two different ways. There's one to run it by power, and then there's one to run it by, I would say, more efficiency, more form related. So when people say running hills, I kind of get into a little bit more detail. What do they mean by that? Because as I've kind of discussed, if you've seen some of my other content, I talk about there being switching gears. And the ability to switch gears, especially during hills, is important, because if you have a longer stride length, you need more power to push up that hill versus someone who takes a shorter stride length. And I kind of related this in another video to bike riding. When you switch gears, you want to be able to pedal faster, not necessarily power through the hill. But that's good for, in my opinion, again, that's good for later on in the season. At the beginning of the season, I do want to work on power. So when I ask people to run up hills, I'm asking them to extend their stride length and not necessarily to run the most efficient way, because I want to build the power at the very beginning of the season. Because I talk about the 7 phases of running. And at the very beginning, when we're building our base building up our distances, that's when I want people to be working on power, weightlifting, mobility exercises. We still do those things throughout the season, but it's more power based. Because then when we get to racing, of course, we want to be quicker when we race, unless our overall goal is just to get to the distance. Then our tactic is a little bit different. But to run up a hill, at the very beginning, I want to work on power, and then later on in the season, we work more on the cadence, so shortening our stride length and working more on our efficiency of running. So I purposely ask people to extend their cadence, and if you follow me on Strava, you'll see that now I start posting my stride length, so that you can you see in the different periods how I'll change it. So near the beginning of the season, when I'm building up my distance and then working some of my hills, I'm actually extending my stride length. And then actually I stop doing hill workouts when I get into the speed portion, when I get into my, okay, I'm preparing for racing now, which is my cycle phases. And so right now I've just completed my build phase, and now I'm in my base phase. So I'm still working on hills, but in my next phase, I will be taking off the hill workouts, because now I want to be focusing more on form in the next phases, so I'm prepared for my race. And my form is usually running up a hill, shortening my cadence, shortening shortening my stride length, but picking up my cadence. And the idea is to keep Of course, when you're running flat, you have a certain effort level, and then when you go up a hill, if you were to try to keep that same pace, you'd have to expend more energy. So when I'm racing, actually, I'm trying to keep that same effort level throughout the entire race. So I'm adjusting my speed or my gears while I'm running. And here's a tip for you if you're running a race. I actually pre-plan my entire race, the entire length. So I know what I want to do in mile 1, mile 2, mile 3, blah, 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 whatever the distance is my race. And when I do that, I will actually adjust. So I know, for instance, that I will run up this hill and here's the speed that I want to be at. And because I've been, honing in on my skills, I kind of know the pace and the cadence that I'm at because I'm always checking those types of metrics while I'm running and practicing. So when I run up a hill, I don't get nervous that my pace is going to drop because typically, there's a flat and then there's a downhill, and I know how fast I can run those, and I kind of get a general understanding of how long that's going to be in the race. So I can keep the same effort level and know when I need to kind of turn on the gas pedal to put in a little bit more effort to make up for some things later on when it's easier. Meaning on a downhill, if my downhill is just as equal as my uphill, and I can slow down on the downhill but keep that same effort level, and that's what I try to do. So just a little tip there. So that's all I wanted to say about running. When people say do hill workouts, I believe that there's a time and a place to do certain hill workouts, and the way you do the certain hill workouts is important too. But that's my spiel on hills from the next level method, I guess you could call it. How about questions from the audience on specifics about hill running that, let's just say, you like my advice, but right now it's kind of too late, or you're in the middle, or you just don't believe me, but you have a different question about hills. I don't think hills are bad, to be honest. You can do them throughout the season. I just have a certain way of approaching it in my program. So any questions, just make sure to hit that question mark or just type it in there and I will answer your specific questions about hills. Let's see. So I'm going to keep going on hills until I see a question. So let's see. So how do you run hill? How do you know what the right gear is? Well, that's actually a good question. You have to play with it. When you're running a flat, here we go. Here's a question. What is better for a beginner like I am, running a hilly route or doing hill repeats? That's a really good question. If going back to sort of what I was saying earlier, hill repeats, I definitely agree on doing at the beginning of the season. If you're later in your season and you're about to race, I would choose routes that simulate the ultimate race. I call it the ultimate race or peak race. You want to be running courses that are similar to that. That's if you're going for a certain pace, I should say. If you're just running a course, meaning you just want to complete, say, a half marathon, 10K, 5K, it doesn't matter, then choosing the right course won't necessarily matter, and then you could do hill repeats throughout. But a hilly route, if you have a hilly course, typically I would say match your running cycles to your actual race. And you can usually get those maps online now, which they're really cool. They map them out with their Garmin watches, and so you can see the elevation. And if you can't get that simulation, meaning that where you run is pretty much flat everywhere and maybe you have that one hill, then I would do hill repeats for sure, because other than that, you're going to end up running hill repeats anyways to kind of simulate that course. So at the beginning, hill repeats throughout the rest of when I'm getting ready to race and really working on my speed and everything and my form and my efficiency, then I'm doing hilly routes that simulate the race that I'm going to be in. Good question. Good question. Another question I get is, how fast should I run the hills? How fast should I run the hills? That's actually a good question, because you want to simulate racing as much as possible, but you can go a little bit faster because you're not running. Let's say you're doing a 5K and you're doing hill repeats. Then you want to be at a faster pace, but you have to kind of know what that means. So, for instance, if I'm doing, let's say, an easy, if I'm running a certain pace, I know what all my runs are going to be at what pace. Meaning, if I go to a track and I'm doing 200s, I know what my relative pace should be for a 200. I know what my relative pace should be for a 400. And then, based on that, let's say I was going to do a track and do 400s, and I know what my pace should be at that moment for those 400s for my particular pace that I want to hit for my race. And then I go to a hill. That's going to actually tell me a little bit about how I'm going to perform in a race, and then I can do some adjustments. So again, for hill, at first I would say start off easier and then try to get to a pace where you feel like you are putting in the effort, but not so much that you can't do the number of reps that you're doing. So you don't want to expend too much energy and then you die after 2 repeats, but you also don't want to do too easy that you're not feeling like you really worked. So it's a little play in there. How many repeats, if I'm doing hill repeats, how many repeats should I do? That is all depending on your race. Meaning if you have a 5K, you don't have to do as many. If you're doing a marathon, you have to do more than somebody doing 5K. And typically I have, let's say I do as many as I can, to be honest. And that typically comes out to maybe 2 to 4 repeats of, if I'm doing a 5K, of a 400 meter length of a hill. So if I'm doing 400 meters and I'm doing 4 of them, that means I'm doing 2 miles of hills, a mile warm up and a mile cool down. If I'm going to a 10K, then I may go to 5 and 6 hill repeats. And if I'm going to, did I say 10K? 10K. If I do a half marathon, then I'm going to 7, 8. If I'm doing a marathon, maybe 9, 10. Something like that. Oh, here's a question. How high should the hill be to train effectively? That's a very good question. How high should the hill be? So if you're talking later in the season, again, just mimic your racing. If you're at the very beginning of your season and you're doing hill repeats, I did one where you kind of go up and then kind of flattens out and goes up. I love those for whatever reason. So usually I have something that goes up about maybe 200 to 150 meters. I don't measure these. It's just rough estimate. What I do is I take my watch and I run a hill and I wait till I get to, in my world, I do miles, so I apologize, it's 0.25. But if you can get your watch to say 400 meters, that's pretty much what I'm looking at, and halfway looking for a flat and going up. How steep should that hill be? Play with it. That's where it gets fun, because if you run the same hill all the time, it might get a little bit boring. So play with it. Sometimes I like to find the steepest hill, and I die and I can't make it 400 meters. I'll get to like maybe 200 meters and I say, okay, that's high enough, and I'll come down, but I'll just play with it. Because, one of the things about running is that we get so caught up in the specifics, but you know what? Some of the flavor in running is just experimenting, having fun with doing different things, different hills. So for me, it's more the distance, not how steep it is. I'll mix it up and just find different hills if I get bored with a hill. Recently, for me, it's just been going up, finding a flat, and then going up again, because I typically find those are the trickier hills mentally that I have to go over. So that might be a key to what you might want to do, is practice something that mentally challenges you. You're like, oh, one that's like super straight up. I've done those. I'm pretty happy with the way I approach those. If those scare you, then maybe that's the ones that you should be doing. Thank you. Are there any tips to run downhill? It should be the easy part, but it's not. Yes, you're right. A lot of us focus on the uphill and not so much on cresting the hill and coming down the hill. And there's actually a way you should be running at the top of the hill versus going up the hill, and how you should run down the hill. But downhill running is the hardest of them all, because you want gravity to do its work and bring you down the hill, and you want to recover after all the hard work that you've gone through. But if you keep your effort level, and that's why I like the effort level feeling in practicing hills, because you want that same effort level. But when you come over that crest and you come down the hill, you don't want to put the brakes on, because if you do, you are going to shoot the energy right out of your quads. Your quads are going to be chewed up, and then you just wasted energy putting on the brakes. But you don't want to overstride, because if you do, then you're putting extra shock on your body, and on top of that, it doesn't feel good, and you can lose control. So what you want to do, and how I practice downhills, is actually strides. So I don't actually do, I would suggest downhills if you want to increase your speed and you still haven't, and you've hit your peak speed, meaning you're doing track workouts, and let's say that you're supposed to be running 200s, and I'm just going to throw out numbers. They're not, and they could be unrealistic. Let's say you want to do a 200 in 30 seconds. But you can only do it in 35, and you're just not getting that speed in there. Then I would do downhill training to practice your turnover of your legs. But for the most part, I will do strides on the downhills if I'm going to do them. But when I'm actually running a downhill, I like to start my stride length at a certain, sort of keep it the same as I'm going down the hill. And if I feel in control, I'll start extending my stride length to the point where I feel in control, not overextending, because you don't want to heel strike, because that's not good for your body, and it will actually slow you down. But you want to be in control. So you want to be on that that sweet spot of not out of control, but not resisting. You kind of have to play with it, and it's actually a skill that you have to learn. It's not anything that people just pick up. I mean, so I guess some people are natural downhill runners. I am not. It is something that I practice. Does that answer your question? I hope that answers your question. But as I hear, if I answered your question, to run over the hill. So in an actual race, if you're running a race, because a race is different than a hill workout, great. When you start getting to the top of a hill, you're very welcome. You should be starting to extend your stride. Hey, Harry, we're just talking about hills here. So when you're going up, if you have any questions, go ahead and either hit the question mark or just type it down there. So you're going up the hill, and in a race, not a practice, and not the pre-practice, as many questions as you want. I said that you should have a shorter stride length and quicker cadence. As you get to the top of that hill, you should be extending your stride length to run through the hill. We've always, in the past, I've always been told to run through the hill. I don't see anything wrong with that. I actually prefer it, because then it starts getting me prepared for the other side and the downhill. And sort of like before I get to the uphill, I actually like to prepare my body. It's almost like when you ride a bike and you don't want to change the gears in the middle of the hill. Your chains all go, and that's just not good. So I have the same philosophy for running. Before I get to the hill, I will actually start shortening my stride length and picking up my cadence so that I'm just going into the hill and I'm maintaining my effort level. So the same at the top, you want to start extending your stride length when you get to the top of the hill and if it goes flat. How often should you do hill training? I do it once a week. So once a week I do hill training at the very beginning, and then of course if I'm training for a race, I will mimic the race, and I'm always practicing my form up a hill. And so technically speaking, I'm always training hills, but in my area I have hills everywhere, so I can't escape them. So I'm always sort of training hills anyways. But if you're talking specific hill workouts like repeats and stuff, I would say once a week. You could get away with 2 at the very beginning, but I don't see any need to do more than 1 times a week, but 2 is not bad either. When should I run my last long run before my marathon? Um, and how long's your long run? When you say long run, how long is that? Oh, great. Good. Good. You want to keep those legs fresh at this point. Yeah, it depends on how long is your long run. If we're talking, you know, 2 hours or something like that, I would I would do that even all the way up to, um, let's see, when I was doing my half marathon, everything between 20 to 30 kilometers. Sorry, I have to compute that in my head. 20 kilometers, that's about 12 miles in my world. Um, so 12 miles. Yeah, I think you could do that all the way up to the last week. Like the last week, I would not do that much personally, but you could do that all the way up to the prior week. Um, but that's under my running 2.5 to 3 hours. Yeah, you could do that right up to, especially because you're going into another one, right? After you're done this half marathon, or sorry, after this marathon, you're gonna train for another one, correct? Within the same year, if I remember correctly. And in that case, you're kind of using this one as a gauge as to how you're going to perform. Yeah. So this one's sort of like your test first one. So for me personally, I would actually just go ahead the week before, that would be the maximum I would do a long run. That final week, um, where you're gonna do your race, definitely I would lay off and simulate your perfect your race week. So for me, I train the same way all the way up to the last week, and then I drop down. But there's a difference between how I train the last, let's say, I have a taper phase right before my big race. So I run that completely different than the rest of my season. And in this case, you're using this as your base. So I would, yeah, then tomorrow I'll run my last run. I think that's a smart idea. I don't see anything wrong with that, um, because it's your first one. If you feel like you are so sluggish the next week, and let's just say it doesn't work, um, then you learn from that for your next one. I'm a big proponent of trying the general, uh, what generally is being told out there, and then adjusting for your particular journey, because you are an individual, and how I run versus how you run is totally different, totally mentally, totally physically. So always start with the generic. I'm okay with that, which is go ahead and run your normal workouts, but that last week I would definitely edge off. but I wouldn't run last long run. I would actually cap it, meaning I would aim for a certain distance like you normally would, but maybe just cap the time so that you wouldn't run longer than, let's say, 2.5 hours, or 2 hours, and just say that's it. No matter what happens, no matter how fast I run, I would cap it at 2 hours to kind of hold you back a little bit, so that the next week you go into it like really. And to be honest, just to help you for your marathon, treat this week like you would. So you're going to use this as your pivot. And I call it a pivot, or like a time trial. I'll call it a time trial. But you obviously want to do the best you can, and you're going to do the best you can. But also treat it like like you want this to be your perfect week. So next week when you go into it, try to make it as perfect as possible. What you're going to eat, you know. So for me, like that last week, if I'm running 5 miles, let's say if I was training for a marathon and I was only going to do 5 miles next week, and let's say I'm going to have water stations along that way, I am simulating my race. And let's say at mile 4 or 3, there's going to be a water station. Guess what I'm going to do next week at mile 3 and 4 on all my runs leading up to that race? I'm going to I'm going to pretend there's a water station, and I'm just getting my body ready and mentally in that mode. And then when you go to your final race, your like peak race, this is it. This is going to be the one. You will know and go through that routine as much as possible. So hopefully that helps as another tip for your marathon for that's coming up. I'm so excited. I can't wait to hear how it goes.